Dipti, thank you so much for joining me. So, before I kind of dive in a little deeper into the report that you just put out, first, a more broad question. So, why is it that vegetable prices are spiking so much in recent years as perhaps compared to previous years?
So, if you look at vegetable inflation, there's a trend rate of growth. On average, it's 3.8% or so. But if you look at the last, say, 100 months only, CPI vegetable inflation was above that trend average in 49 months. In fact, it spiked higher than even 7% in 35 months. So that's the kind of spikes that we've been seeing. It's been a lot and a lot more frequent in recent years. So, one, of course, is the increasing intensity and frequency of extreme weather events, be it unseasonal rains, deficient or excess rains, even heat waves, cyclones, and floods. So, intensity of some of these has increased a lot in recent years. Now, there are various studies which look at the impact of weather shocks on vegetable prices. Some sort of point toward, for instance, there's an interesting one in EPW which talks about how cyclones have a bigger impact. There's something that's been done by ICRIAR which talks about how unseasonal rains in the pre-monsoon period of, say, March to May tends to have a bigger impact. There's also attribution given to pest attacks as a result of these untimely rains and excess moisture, etc. So I think what's really important to understand is that a lot of it has been happening because these climate shocks have become more rampant, more frequent, and highly intensive in nature. Now, to understand here is one thing, vegetables tend to be more susceptible to uneven weather compared to food grains, for instance. And that really answers your question on why vegetable price spikes have increased in recent years. But another thing is, apart from climate shocks, what we also saw is that underneath it lies the fact that there are demand-supply mismatches, which are constantly causing prices to stay vulnerable on the edge. And these tend to spike up and down whenever there's a positive or negative weather shock.
So, what's changing, or at least on a more linear fashion, on the demand side?
Basically, if you look at India, there are three things. Number one is the surging population growth, which itself requires us to consume more vegetables in addition to a variety of other things. There's a demographic transition, younger people, a lot more eating out, more of consumption of processed foods, higher incomes that tend to facilitate consumption of non-cereal items, as many studies have found, be it, meat, pulses, including vegetables, a lot of dietary preferences, all of that. So on the demand side, these are some of the factors which have really pushed up consumption. And although supply tends to be high, in fact, we are the second largest producers of vegetables after China, growth has slowed in recent years, and that's fallen short of demand. Now, there's a Niti Aayog study done a while back, not too old, but say 2018 or so, which highlights some of these gaps and goes to suggest how there is at least 2% shortage of availability compared to demand for the year that they've seen in terms of vegetable production and availability.
Right. So we'll come to interventions in a moment, but is there a way? I mean, of course, everything that you've suggested now on the supply side seems to suggest that you cannot at all predict what could happen. But even I'm assuming within this, there must be some common element or common thread that those who are trying to forecast can do.
Yeah, I mean, it's not an easy question to answer, honestly. But if we look at a similar other commodity, where also we did see quite a bit of volatility. And in recent years, there has been an improvement in productivity. That's pulses. So we did a report sometime earlier in July. And what we also realized is that frequent government intervention by facilitating imports, releasing stocks in the market, increasing the procurement after providing an assured minimum support price, etc., all of those seem to have worked because the troughs and the peaks have come down quite a bit. But honestly, emulating some of that for vegetables is not a clear possibility. For one, it's a highly perishable commodity. So, given the existing storage and transportation infrastructure, government procurement and storage is not really the right option at the moment. So that may be considered at some point and to some extent, but the focus will have to be on significantly upgrading cold storage and transport systems going forward. Now, the contrasting case of, potatoes and onions that we've highlighted in our report clearly shows the importance of upgrading existing infrastructure. In potatoes, for example, where cold storage infrastructure has improved, whereas in onions, that was also highlighted in the economic survey, that the storage there still continues to be as per traditional methods. their losses tend to be high. So that's one challenge. The second is, of course, price predictability because of the big unknown that is weather. And I think here, one way to beat that really is to adopt more weather resistant or weather shock resistant techniques for production, which will increase yields and reduce pre and post harvest losses, etc.
Could we be importing more, at least some vegetables? I mean, it does happen in other countries.
Yeah, so I think in the short term, number of these policies that I mentioned that we are using for pulses, including imports, is certainly an option available. In the long run, the focus will have to be on three key aspects. Firstly, which I spoke of, which is improving productivity and enhancing yields. Second is improving post-harvest infrastructure to cut down the losses because there are significant losses even post-production and post-harvest. And finally, I think policy intervention in terms of facilitating research, development, etc., and infrastructure creation such that even private participation is encouraged in the whole process.
Right. And tomatoes, which must have obviously driven vegetable inflation to very high levels, is a classic example. In beginning of September, it was at 300 rupees. By the end of September, it was being thrown and dumped on the roads, isn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, in fact, that clearly shows us the importance of having a price signaling mechanism in place, which is something that has improved for pulses, like I said earlier. So you see, what is vegetables tend to follow something that we call a cobweb pattern. And what happens is that farmers tend to see prices of their crops in one particular season and accordingly so for the following season. So if prices are high, like they were in the June, July period, they tend to sow more. And when that production hits the market, prices crash. And then they sow less and so on and so forth. Honestly, if there is some assurance in terms of predicting prices, knowing that they will not see such adverse price shocks and price movements, they can take better decisions in terms of how much to sow, etc. And that could smoothen some of the prices.
Right. And last question, what's your outlook looking ahead for the rest of this year? And actually, that could mean the rest of this calendar and a good part of the next calendar as well.
Yeah. So I think for vegetables inflation, we don't think price pressures are such a big concern now, at least for the next couple of months, that is ending this calendar year. Mainly because we are seeing supplies now start hitting the market and that will keep prices tamed, except for a couple of vegetables here and there, which tend to see a seasonal, for instance. But like I said earlier, weather remains the biggest unknown, be it unseasonal rains, heat waves. When those weather shocks strike, whether it's hitting a crop that is ready to be harvested, etc. And therefore, it shouldn't be a surprise, really, according to us, because we now seem to know the real reason why price spikes do happen. It's the gap that exists between demand and supply. So I think over time, focus on improving productivity is the key to tame these price spikes. In fact, it'll be interesting to see that other countries have already identified this trend of demand exceeding supply and are planning for the future. I mean, I came across a research by the Australian Bureau of Agriculture and Resource Economics and Studies, which predicted a 183% increase in vegetable consumption in India between 2009 and 2050, 50, driven by higher income in urban households, for example. So they're planning accordingly. And I think it's high time that we start planning too.
Right. It's interesting that the Australian Bureau of Agriculture has figures that we don't seem to have here. And I'm sure we would watch it and track it as we should. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, Govind. My pleasure.